I'm so pleased to welcome you today to a discussion that is so timely and so important in the environment that we're in. So more and more mobile users around the world are preferring messaging over voice calls. And while that trend might have started between friends and family, it's now the way that consumers are preferring to interact with businesses. So how do you do social messaging well? Well, we're going to take a look at what's the latest in reaching customers in the channels that they're already in and how to leverage social messaging for really rich interactions with your customers. And that's the topic of today and why I'm so excited to have a conversation with three experts who are going to be joining us in a minute. And they'll share their insights and their strategies and their perspectives on this topic. And I'd especially like to thank Cineverse for sponsoring this discussion today. So I'd like to bring our speakers onto stage as everybody's continuing to vote. I see votes coming in, and please do continue. So our first speaker that I'd like to bring on is Greg Verdino. He's a business futurist. He's a digital transformation expert. He's a keynote speaker. He's an author and an advisor. From Cineverse, we are going to be joined by, hi, Greg, how are you?
Hi, how are you, Allison?
Great. So glad to have you here. From Cineverse, we are joined by Pablo Licota. He is the president of the Americas. And we're also going to be joined by Miguel Lopez, who is the director of product management of Cineverse.
Hi there.
Hi, Miguel. Such a pleasure to have you. Hi, Pablo.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Well, so I am very interested in what you all think about the polls that are coming in. So the first question was, where do you think your customers prefer to connect with you most? And I'm very interested to hear what you're thinking of the results. Greg, would you be willing to start us off and help us understand, are the results surprising you?
I don't know that they're surprised. Well, maybe some of it is surprising to me. I think what's not surprising to me is that we're seeing a spill of respondents across multiple channels, right? We're not seeing one channel rise to the top as the single place brands are connecting with their customers. Certainly, if we did this poll a decade or 2 decades ago, that might have been very different, right? Where most brands were doing nothing but phone or phone plus email, but really not engaging consumers or customers on all of the different channels where customers engage. So what I'm seeing here is actually encouraging and very consistent with the way customers do choose to engage with companies. I think some recent research I had seen, or somewhat recent research, I believe it was from Salesforce.com, but there have been studies from a number of different organizations say that the results show that the average customer engages with organizations, the companies with which they do business, across 9+ channels. And after COVID, consumers have been driving or sort of been pushing for organizations to accelerate their adoption of digital channels and to actually offer engagement opportunities across more and more digital channels. So to me, this is very much in line with that. And when I see channels like SMS and push and WhatsApp perform pretty strongly here, what I'm seeing are organizations that are tuned in to what customers expect of them and are getting on board with this sort of multi-channel or omni-digital approach to engaging customers.
What do you think, Pablo? What highlight comes out of the results for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting set of data here. I'm also wondering the different countries where our audience is based, because that triggers another interesting discussion. Meaning WhatsApp having 100% penetration rate in regions like EMEA, Latin America, and Asia Pac. And if you think what that means is like. We have to see, as brands, we have to see the world through our customers' eyes. And there is a difference between how brands are communicating and what the users wants to communicate from. And you can see, for example, in this chart, companies are using in-app messaging 30% of the time, but the customers or the user want to engage through WhatsApp. That's sort of it's not a disconnection, but it's something that more and more we're going to see. As Greg said before, the multi-channel, omni-channel environment will trigger that disconnection between how brands communicate and how the user wants to be communicated.
Miguel, what do you think about this?
Oh, I think the other part I'm noticing here is there's not like WhatsApp does have a slight advantage, but if you look between the two poles, there's an even distribution or almost even distribution across channels, right? And like Pablo was saying, it depends on the country and what's the preferred channel. But what's happening, the enterprises are clearly embracing the omni-channel strategy on how to reach their usage and looking at more on, channel is important, but what I really care is my message getting across, and what is the best channel to get to my user. So what I see here, it kind of shows that this distribution is happening, and it also shows that when we have the question, where do you think your customers prefer to connect, the enterprises are thinking, yes, we need to be distributed. I'm actually surprised to see IVR at 20%. It shows voice is still there. But if we look at it, right, 29, 26, even 16 or 10, right, it means also that from the winner the push notifications, which was at 20%, enterprises want to move past that into actually a more rich business communication in terms of getting all the content in the message instead of just sending something that the user clicks and opens the app. So they get the message, they get the content across.
So it strikes me that what's come up loud and clear in the conversation so far is the immense complexity of what's being faced right now. There's a little bit of feedback. There we go. And in the discussion overall, I think that a lot of interesting topics have come up. So I'm really looking forward to jumping into those. I'll start with this one. Greg, you mentioned the average customer. You said that research is showing that the average customer is using 9 different channels. And this is a question I have for all of you. I'm interested what else we can learn from this research in terms of what is the average customer and how they're using these touch points. Greg, are there other aspects of the research that you would highlight for us?
I mean, I think and of course I haven't memorized the entire research report, but I think the important thing, I think the overriding directive, if you want to think of it that way, that comes out of studies like these is how important it is for organizations to adopt the channels in a meaningful way that their consumers prefer. And of course, yes, to both Pablo's and Miguel's point, those preferences are going to vary region to region, but that we've moved beyond a point where you can have sort of check the box channels, as a lot of organizations have had over the course of time. Even in many ways, phone support was a check the box channel for a lot of companies at one point. It is now increasingly important because consumer expectations are so high that organizations adopt the channels that consumers are using for sure, but also make a serious effort to resource those channels properly and to use those channels effectively. So when I think about what Miguel was saying about, SMS, if you think of the phone as a channel, right, as an Uber channel in a way, over which a lot of these particular tactics might, play out, it used to be okay-ish to do just straight text push notifications and use SMS or whatever. It is becoming less acceptable to do that kind of thing. And, as consumers expect, as Miguel said, the full content package to come to them, not expect them to go to the content package. And as more and more digital communications become richer and richer, it becomes important to ensure that those full communication packages are rich and meaningful and provide the information in a way that's compelling, engaging, and effective from a communication standpoint.
Pablo, Miguel, does this resonate with you?
Yeah, and I'll take this one, Miguel, but we have seen that exact dynamic that Greg mentioned before. I mean, 67 to 70% of the enterprises fight their customers base or their competition through customer experience. That's the main driver. You can see most of the metrics they're using is Net Promoter Score, And those metrics are actually very important for them. And how do you create that that environment where you're close to your customers through the messaging environment, not through a push or a very isolated transaction, right? Even when an IVR call, stating, waiting online, just listening to that little music there all the time, that's not how people want to get treated, right? So if you think about that customer experience component of that equation, this messaging environment is actually driving that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So regionality has come up a lot in the conversation so far. And so I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into that. Pablo, I think you brought it up, but first, can you help us understand a little bit more detail how regionality really plays into this and what kind of differences you're seeing with different regions?
Well, that's a great question. If you think about social media, I'm actually responsible for the Americas. So I run the US, Canada, and Latin America. So I got this part of the world. But WhatsApp is a great example. We got 100%, almost 98% penetration in Latin America. And that is a mature, sophisticated environment to exchange rich media. In the US, it's not the same case. In the US, you got more SMS and RCS driven type of exchange with customers. So if I'm a brand trying to communicate, most likely going to use that WhatsApp critical mass to talk to my Latin American community, even in Asia Pacific or in Europe, and then continue to drive SMS engagements in the US. And get that intelligence through different layers, bot, artificial intelligence, machine learning, that will trigger those conversations based on what is the best way to talk. So I think the ecosystem moving into that space where the intelligence of the conversation is taking more relevant, and the channel become that effective tool to communicate to the right people at the right time.
Miguel, how do you think of regionality?
So I think, what Pablo says is absolutely right in terms of certain countries drive certain channels and the enterprises tend to default to that, right? Because you want that reach. What we see, for example, in North America being an interesting example, like SMS is the clear winner here in terms of the preference for enterprises. But as we start seeing, more companies adopting RCS, more companies adopting Apple Business Chat as well, something we don't hear much often, but a lot of if you look at the percentage of iPhones, right, in North America, it's very high even compared to other countries worldwide. So the enterprises, they know that the SMS is the default option to get everywhere, right, to get to most. But as they start looking in their region how things are trending, right, they also start looking what else can they leverage from these new channels. Because the Twilio CEO has a very interesting, Jeff Lawson's a very interesting phrase that always got my ear, which is the consumer smartphone is the most valuable piece of real estate there is right now out there, right? So are you going to leverage it just to get a text across? Or are you going to leverage to provide a full experience where in the same message, without needing to go to the content, right, as Greg was saying, in that interaction with 2 clicks, they can convert a lead into a customer. So what's happening is, right, in certain countries, this is happening. It's Latin America with WhatsApp. We've seen in Asia with Kakao Talk and Viber and different others, right? So the enterprises, they're trying to keep up with the trends. And the truth is, it's hard to, because in a year, WhatsApp might be the leader. Who knows, next year a startup comes in and launches the next big messaging app, right? So an enterprise, what it needs is to have, first of all, a rich business messaging strategy, which is, and look at what is the lowest common denominator, right, across all these different channels they're offering rich business. And then have also a strategy then to default to SMS would one of these things fail, right? Because they still want to reach and need to do it in different ways. And we're seeing that happening. So we're seeing that SMS is being overtaken by these rich business messaging. What happens is the enterprises are always asking, can we keep the SMS in the stack just in case everything else fails?
Greg, how do you think of leveraging that real estate on the phone, that precious real estate?
I mean, I would agree. I mean, I agree with the, I can't remember the name of the person you just referenced, but Miguel, the
Jeff
the
Lawson
quote about the
Twilio.
about the consumer mobile device being the most valuable piece of real estate. I think what's interesting, and this kind of ties together a couple of things, and then also even goes back to some of what you were saying during your opening remarks, Allison. It's not just the most valuable piece of consumer real estate, it's the most valuable piece of communications real estate. And I think what we're starting to see is, I mean, we've seen it, but as it pertains to messaging, I think what we're starting to see are even B2B markets start to adopt B2C comm strategies, right, and tactics. I'll use a simple example. I recently completed a project with a country, the government of a MENA region, where everything other than the delivery of our documents pretty much happened over WhatsApp. Where normally any other client, I'm communicating on phone, I'm communicating on email. Of course, everyone's doing Zoom calls or whatever, but pretty much all of the day-to-day ongoing communication was happening on WhatsApp with these government officials in this MENA country. That acknowledges, on the one hand, obviously, the way some of these platforms have different regional biases, but also the fact that we can't make assumptions that some of these things that look and sound and feel like consumer communications platforms are specifically being used for consumer applications anymore, right? They are now relevant business communication channels as well. Going to the sort of the broader context of the value of the mobile device as communications real estate, I would probably echo everything Miguel and Pablo have been saying here. This is a smartphone or a smart device is a device that has such a broad and rich array of capabilities that I feel like in many ways we've moved beyond the point that enterprises could say, let's pick this one thing that this device does and double down there, right? I think we need to, as whether you're a marketer or a customer experience expert or a comms person or a customer service person, organization, think about how do we make the most out of the full capabilities of the device that we're developing and delivering content for and on. Of course, with the caveat, as Miguel notes, that we do need to have fallback. We can't just do rich media messaging, for example, without having the ability to fall back to something that's less rich for consumers that don't have the capability or where there's other kinds of reasons where a comms might fail.
I think it's so fascinating, and as I mentioned earlier, it's so complex to understand how to prioritize and where to spend resources in this. I want to dive more into that, but as a pre-question, I guess, for that discussion, we talked about regionality, but we haven't really gone into demographic differences beyond regionality. And so I'd really like to understand, how should we be thinking about how demographics come into play with this, and how companies need to account for differences in their, I'd say, consumer basis, but I probably should say in their interactions, because Greg, you brought up the point that it is even beyond B2C, but in there, how should customers be thinking about, or companies be thinking about demographics as they're going about these choices? Pablo, would you be willing to start in on that one?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question, and I've seen this coming up more frequently, especially in the financial community, banks and fintechs. If you see how they address their consumers, they've got different approaches, and that is related to the segmentation of their base. They understand exactly, or to a certain level of accuracy, how their customers behave. I'll give you an example with a bank. They do have customers that prefer to deal with the bank on a branch as a physical asset, and they still want to be there, which means that from the digital ecosystem, you lose them. You don't know exactly what they're doing. You rely on your people to deliver that service, but you cannot track exactly what happens there. And then you got to segment that base. That will be people that willing to do specific transactions on that branch. So demographics are incredibly critical. What I think is going on here is that actually, as you put more and more people into a digital environment, you get the capability of actually tracking and understanding data points, and actually get a sense of those users' mood as they move into the communication process, which is not the case when you're doing a physical interaction. So in the case of the banks, they're trying to build that CRM system in the back, who's not going to drop the transaction if you start in a branch and then you move into the phone in the home banking application, you still have visibility of that. So a way to deal with that demographic is by, again, data mining and providing the right channel to the right time so they can deal with that demographic in particular. But there's multiple segmentations depending on the industry.
Miguel, how do you think about demographics in prioritization?
So, it would sound like it's common sense to say that the younger people or the younger generations would be the ones that would be more susceptible or more exposable to the rich media. But I would be wrong, actually, because the truth is, when we massified access to smartphones as part of, the operator subsidizing devices and all of that, and the smartphones itself became so easy to use, even the older generations, without any knowledge on how to use them, they get this rich business content in their phones. And if we look at it, they're more impressionable. If you take someone on the younger generations, they're used to all the latest and greatest and the images and animations and whatever you can think of. If you think on the the demographics, let's say from 50 up, right, where these people, they were here when the mobile generation started. They were used to SMS. Well, they were used to phone calls only. They got introduced to SMS, and I qualify in that space because SMS was, well, the latest and greatest when I was a teenager. That was barely used, and that it was getting old. Now suddenly this rich business messaging is coming, and it's bringing all this capability for interaction, right? You think one of the things, and I can give an example, like an IKEA or an enterprise of that type that wants people to be able to visualize their furniture just within the message, right? Where people can do, like, from the images, and they can click and they can do certain simulations with buttons, which is a part of rich business messaging. That has a much more profound impact if you look demographically on the older generations, right? Because it's right there, it's easy to use, than it would be on the younger ones that are less impressionable nowadays with what they're getting there. So for an enterprise, right, especially the one that caters services for the demographics, let's say from the 40s or 50s up, right, being able to leverage this new technology that's easy to access, by default available, and where they can really get that impact. I see this as a huge advantage on how to leverage it, and how demographics do play an important part on how to prioritize your content and the rich business message channel you'd be using to do that.
It's such an important point, and I imagine too that the experiences of the last year and a half have pushed those over the edge that weren't living their lives in this way, this digital way, over the edge. Would you say that, Miguel?
Yes, well, the pandemic, unfortunately, it forced us to do everything remotely. It forced enterprises to rethink how we do it. Forced us how to relive our life and work nowadays, right? So when it comes for the enterprises and how to reach, it really made them rethink this, improve it. And the part is, you can't say, like, oh, once the pandemic is completely over and we're 100% back to normal, that we'll go back to the old ways. No, this has completely changed the paradigm on how enterprises are reaching their end consumers and readapt their strategies in a way that is going to continue. Not you might say that it's not going to be that brutal growth that happened because we were forced to readapt very quickly. But what I see is, like, that curve is going to keep going, a bit more stable, but it's going to keep growing, and it's going to keep forcing enterprises to keep rethinking, because all of them have very talented people in their marketing departments, right? They always need to think on how to surpass and how to leverage these new features they have available on this rich business messaging channels.
Okay, so as we've been having this conversation, I've been wondering, what does this all mean for omnichannel? So obviously for years, we've been striving to achieve omnichannel communication with our customers. And obviously, from what we're seeing in the polls and what we've discussed, omnichannel is far more complicated. So I want to ask you all and get your perspective on what does omnichannel really mean today? Greg, would you be willing to start us off?
I would. I'm going to answer in what may be sort of a, I don't know, maybe a vague kind of way. is I think omni-channel, I know the term seems to have fallen a little bit out of favor for whatever reason, but I think in practice, it's more important than ever before. Now, we can argue over what constitutes omni in an omni-channel world, but I think it's become less and less feasible for an organization to pick and choose channels in a world where consumer preference, consumer behavior, consumer expectations are evolving so quickly as they relate to these communication or connection touch points. You can't say, well, we'll be here but not over there, because you're bound to get eclipsed by consumer change, right? But the other thing is, when I think about omnichannel, what I think about is minimizing, reducing, maybe even eliminating the level of effort required on the part of the customer to get what they need. Whether that's an answer to a question, access to a product, more information, entertaining content, whatever it is, right? We live in this access economy where everything is on demand. It's real time. It's all accessible. It's all available. And that applies, it's an expectation maybe that's been kind of sort of that the consumers have, that consumers have adopted at the hands of things like Amazon Prime and certainly Spotify and Netflix and whatever. But what I'm seeing is that is the new standard by which every organization is now being judged, right? Even if you're in, parts manufacturing, your buyers expect you to be accessible, to provide options and availability, to communicate clearly and effectively, to deliver stuff in real time, et cetera. And in order to meet that demand and to strip away the effort required by the customer, you need to be available on the channels that are most effective and most used by that customer. So to me, omnichannel, call it something different if you want to, but as a strategy, to me, is still incredibly important.
Pablo, what do you think? How do you think about omnichannel and what it means today?
Absolutely. I think it's, I will say the omnichannel is the execution of a much bigger game plan here. And if you think about what brands are trying to do, which is communicate effectively, it is all about what we call orchestration, right? How you orchestrate the different ways to talk, but also in the back, the different systems where you pull information to create content for those users. And that's one of the critical aspects of this omni-channel. It's just not the availability of the channels, because they are available, but is the orchestration behind those channels that will make you really relevant. Remember, Miguel said that it's the most precious real estate, but also people are very, very polluted with a lot of digital noise. So you got to be not only accurate, but also relevant when you communicate. And that is back into the intelligence you build in that communication. So that's the main challenge that we're seeing with brands. It's just not what channel should I use, but okay, this is my overall architecture. This is a transactional message, promotional message. This is the marketing team talking, then the customer care team talking, and then you got the sales team talking, and they all want to do that effectively. So that orchestration is becoming more and more relevant.
So here's another question that's come up for me as we've been talking is what's really going on with IVR? So I'm hoping you can share with us how voice is comparing to messaging, and there's clearly a shift away from messaging with these new channels. Is that widespread? Is it isolated to certain segments? Does voice matter anymore? We're seeing that there's responses in the polls for that. Who wants to jump in on that one?
Having been in the voice world for over a decade, I think I'm slightly qualified to answer that one and why IVR is still. So we've seen, especially now during the pandemic, but even before, right, there's been an explosion in contact center softwares, right, platforms from TalkBest and all of these other guys. We love messaging, right? But when we're angry, when we're not satisfied, or when we have questions, we want to talk with someone in real time, right? I want to call a number, and maybe that's when demographics actually do play a big part, because the younger generations love to text, right? I can't get my son to call me. He texts me all the time, right? But the thing is, I want to grab a phone and call someone, and I don't want to be on hold for 10 minutes listening to music, right? As Pablo was saying, but I want to be filtered that the person that's going to answer my call, right, is going to be the person that I need to talk to, that will be able to answer my question or to help me with my issue. And I think that's why IVR is still very used, especially because before we would speak about IVR, now IVR is a part of these contact center softwares, right? It's how people call in and what they're exposed to first, right? So that's why I see it here. Now, this is also a big opportunity for enterprises. Why? To mix both the messaging and the IVR, right? Because I went through a situation not long ago where I had a problem with one of my devices, and I had to reach out to the enterprises, and I started by submitting a ticket, right? And they reached out through me through a rich business message saying, "Hi, we got your situation." They asked me a couple of questions over text, and then they sent me a link. And suddenly I click, and I'm on a video call. Right? Where with my phone, they're showing the device. So they're seeing live what the problem is without having to take pictures going back and front. So voice and video are what I consider real-time communications. And they're very, very important to specific sectors, especially on care lines, right? We have customers of ours that look into, for example, to us for video, for their care lines, for their luxury brands, for example, because they want that personalized touch. They want that human factor, though it's a remote thing, but we're seeing a face, we're explaining, we're showing. So IVR is the base of that, because voice, that's been what we've known for many decades as the primary engagement model with the enterprises.
That's fascinating. Okay, so here's another question. There's so much to think about across all these different channels. And so I want to get an understanding of what that means when you're planning campaigns. So when you're planning a campaign, what are some of the most important things to plan for? What do you think, Pablo? Would you be willing to start with this one? Oh, we lost your voice.
You hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Sorry, I can, yeah.
So that's a great question. The way that we help brands is actually with the customer journey design. I think that's the first step, where you pretty much laid out. There's different tools out there, but you laid out the customer journey from awareness of the brand or the service or whatever you're going to do, then the transaction that you want to execute on that, and then how you close the loop and build loyalty out of that specific engagement. And from there, you start building up pain points, gain points, and then at the end, decide how you're going to communicate. But at least when you're looking into campaigns, the first thing to do is just solve the specific customer problem. And then you map it out in different stages, and then you decide how you're going to solve that problem through the omnichannel strategy that Greg mentioned before.
And Greg, I saw you nodding a lot. Tell us, seems like that was resonating with you.
I was nodding because if you had gone to me first, the first thing I probably would have mentioned was customer journey mapping. And it's so refreshing to hear somebody else bring that up other than me, because I still find a lot of organizations don't go through the rigor of mapping customer journeys. And that's a vital first step, because if you don't understand how consumers are making their decisions at each stage of that journey, you'll never understand how to provide for their information needs. So I think that's a critical first step that goes to sort of a broader strategic approach that you can kind of think of as orchestrating your communications across each of those touch points across the journey. Because at each stage, you're going to have to, you have to solve a customer's information need, right? And that's where ideas like pains and gains, which Pablo mentioned, become critical. Like, what am I trying to do, or what is, as a consumer, a customer, what am I trying to do here? What do I need in order to make my next decision? Which probably, until you get close to the end, isn't the decision to buy from your company. It might be, I need to build a consideration set. It might be I need to understand what this means for me from this perspective or that perspective or whatever. But it's making sure you know very clearly what is the information someone needs at what stage, and what is the best way to deliver that information. And of course, that's where channels and touch points come in. And it's orchestrating every message from the very start of that journey to the very end of that journey, so that there is a sort of curriculum of communications that's clear, that's compelling, and that is, that serves the customer, not just the company.
So how do we measure success with these efforts? How do we think about KPIs? How do we think about ROI? And I know ROI is especially a complicated topic because the value we get from one channel over another has so many different dimensions. Miguel, would you be willing to start us off on this one? I know I asked some very complicated questions.
Well, I hope I'm giving good answers to them. So let's start with success, right? So over the last decades where digital marketing has exploded, I think we have set some very good parameters on measuring success. If you look, for example, on the CPM and conversion rates, where people say if it's more than 3% is considered a success, that people clicked on your ad, or for every 1,000 visualizations, you have 3 clicks. When it comes to messaging, obviously these parameters are much higher than just for every 1,000 messages you get like 3 people to interact with them. But I think that's one part of measuring, right? And these digital agencies, right, they have this pretty well mapped up, because a lot of what they do with their enterprises and their SLAs and quality agreements are based on this, right, and set by them. The return of investment is the real interesting one, as you said, because there's obviously the conversion, right? You converted a lead into a buying, and then obviously there's the loyalty after that. But awareness, that's very important. It's not a currency that we can see, right? That we can say we spent $10,000 in this campaign and we generated $50,000 in sales, right? But it has a real value in how you present your company, right, to the end consumer. Has a multiplying effect into that value, because even if you did not convert that consumer into a buyer, but you presented your message well, right? You presented it's like your website. It's how you present. It's your window shopping, right? The consumer might not, if I get a rich business message for some automobile vendor, right, where it is really well presented with a 3D view of the car and something that I'm like, wow, this is cool. I might not be in the stage that I'm buying car right now, because it's something that it's not you do every year or every month, right? But I can look at that and say, well, the next time I'm definitely going to consider this, because, clearly I judge that enterprise based on how they presented themselves, even before I step into a dealership to test drive the car, right? If I get just an SMS with a link, it'll be like, okay, this is like what Pablo said. It's just digital noise for me, right? I'll ignore it. I won't take a look. And it might be the best car and the cheapest in the world, but it's not. So the return of investment comes on not only the conversions, but how much did you value your brand or added value to your brand based on the way how you presented yourself to the consumer.
Yeah.
And if I can add one comment on that one, Allison, I'm sorry, Greg, on that.
I was just going to ask you to add, I want to hear what you
have to say. But this is a great point, because as you go into new technologies on RCS, which is something that is taken off worldwide and in the US as well, as Miguel said, return of investment is one, but on RCS, we're having one specific metric, which is residual value of that engagement. Meaning that when somebody engaged in a conversation and dropped that discussion, for example, browsing a new car, they tend to come back 1 day later, 2 days later, and you don't have to resend the communication staying there. It's idle, but it's relevant because it is in the messaging environment. So they always come back to that messaging to talk to their, wife, family, and hey, by the way, I forgot about this car again, and then they start the engagement again. That residual value is actually part of that rich messaging environment where you can engage more and more.
Yeah, I mean, ROI is obviously one thing. Is as complicated as ROI is a very specific formula, right? And certainly there are ways for any channel, depending on how you're using that channel and what your objectives are for that channel. There are ways, of course, to measure directly attributable revenue, especially for a digital channel, or to look at the way the use of a channel accelerates a conversion. But when Pablo's talking about perceivable value, or earlier when I was talking about sort of customer effort, and a lot of organizations are now doing customer effort scoring, or when you look at the way the way effective communications, messaging, whatever, contribute to the customer experience, and how that might get reflected in something like customer sat or net promoter score or brand favorability indices or things like that. When you go back to the notion, I believe it was Pablo mentioned it earlier in the conversation, about how most organizations are now competing primarily on the customer experience, when the way you use these communications channels contributes to or detracts from the customer's perception of that experience. It has a sort of a broader, more meaningful sort of impact on the business that gets to what Miguel was talking about, the brand impact, which isn't to say we shouldn't measure like traditional, does this drive revenue and profit ROI? We might, depending on the objective for the channel. But there is this much larger issue at play, which is how are we building our brand, or how is our failure to communicate effectively tearing our brand down?
I feel like the conversation that we've just had, I feel like I've got 10 different questions I want to ask as follow-ons, but we're almost out of time. So I think I'm going to have to stick with a speed round question just to end for us. And one theme that I think has come up across so loud and clear is the level of complication and the level of change, and how this change is a true constant. So I would like to ask you for one last piece of advice for all of our listeners. What would you suggest is a guiding principle or something to really hold close? One last piece of advice as they face that challenge. So, Greg, would you be willing to start? One last piece of advice.
It's going to be simple. It's going to almost sound stupid, but you need to really understand the customer. And understanding the customer means understanding them each and every day, not what you knew about your customer 18 months ago, but really being a student of the way your consumer behaves and how your consumer is changing.
Oh, I love the way you said that. Miguel, what do you think? What's the last piece of advice?
I think it has to be in a way that whatever you want to execute, right, don't make it very complex, not both in terms of planning and execution, meaning that, if you have to invent the wheel every time you need to do a campaign, right, rebuild applications, rebuild content, rebuild everything from scratch, it's going to be very hard, and you're going to end up losing get lost in the path and confuse your consumers. Study your consumers, as Greg says, right? And then find the commonality across technology, across content, that you can drive a consistent story that your consumers will resonate with.
Pablo, what about you? A last piece of advice?
One sentence. See the world through your customer's eyes. That will do it. That will do the magic.
Wow, there, everyone has it. That was wonderful. Thank you to all of you. And I want to really thank Cineverse for making today's conversation possible. I want to thank everybody that listened in, and a very warm thank you to all our speakers. Thank you, Greg and Miguel and Pablo, for sharing your perspective with us. Thank you.